Hi guys, Jeff Gatz here. Today let's talk a little bit about one of the coolest songs off Animals as Leader's latest album, Mind Spun. If you haven't already watched my cover video, please check that out. And while you're watching this video, please refer to my transcription, which is available on my website for free at www.gatzdrams.com. Last, if you haven't already, please also visit Matt Garstk's website where he has a lesson that you can buy from him. I'm sure that you probably already know this, but he's the drummer for Animals as Leaders. He's awesome. Having said that, I'm proud to say that I actually did not watch his lesson, and instead I learned this song completely and transcribed it completely on my own, just through listening. So, anyway, here we go. Hope you have a good time watching this video and that you learn a lot. So, Section A. The time signature in Section A is 7/4, which means that there are 7 counts in each measure, and that 1 count is equal to a quarter note. This section is characterized by its syncopated, almost jazzy 16th note foot pattern that's played underneath a laid-back, kind of halftime backbeat. The snare drums begin on the 3rd quarter note of the first measure of the phrase, and then continues hitting every 4th quarter note until the entire bass drum pattern repeats after 2 measures. Throughout these 2 measures, you'll be accenting what you're playing on the bass drum with your crash cymbals and china cymbals. So, first let's start with just the foot pattern so you can hear what it sounds like all by itself. Now let's add in the snare drum. Last, I'm going to add in cymbals and play this piece as it's actually written in my notation. Moving on to Section B. This is basically the same as Section A, except that you'll hit your snare drum every 2 quarter notes instead of every 4. Along with that, you'll also play quarter notes on an open hi-hat, so in effect you'll be playing double time or twice as fast over top of this same bass drum pattern that you played in Section A. The only slight difference with the bass drum is that you'll play a few fewer notes so that you don't actually end up hitting the bass drum at the same time as you're hitting the snare drum. So let's take a look at that bass drum pattern one more time. Like I said, it's going to be just a little bit different than from Section A. So here's an example of what that sounds like. Next, I'm going to add in the snare and the hi-hat. Cool. Let's move on to section C. Section C is where things get a little bit more complicated, with time signatures at least. So let's take a look at what's happening. This section is made up of a measure of 11/8, followed by a measure of 13/8, followed by 11/8 again, followed last by 5/4. So that may sound kind of frightening, but these time signatures can actually be broken down into bite-sized pieces that make them easier to count and to play. For example, take 11/8. That's basically a measure of 5/4 plus one extra eighth note. If you break it all down into eighth notes, for example, then 5/4 time can just be thought of as 10/8, which means that all you have to do is add an extra eighth note to turn 10/8 into 11/8. So take a look at this. This is just going to be a measure of 5/4. Now let's compare that 5/4 with 11/8 so you can see what the difference is. And last but not least, let's play that measure of 11/8, how it actually sounds in the song. So next, let's look at the measure of 13/8 and apply the same idea here, but instead it can be thought of a measure of 6/4 with one extra eighth note. So again, if you think of 6/4 in terms of only eighth notes, then basically that would be 12/8. And to turn 12/8 into 13/8, you simply need to add an extra eighth note. So here's an example of just straight 6/4. And last, here is the real measure of 13/8 as it's played in the song. Section E. Let's skip section D for now and jump instead over to section E. The reason I want to do that is because this section is very similar to section C, with the exception of the pattern that your hand will play on the trash hats. In section C, your hand plays the trash hat every quarter note, but now it will begin to play quarter notes at first and will then jump into a Latin bossa nova clave style pattern. So here's how that sounds right now. Section D. Alright, now we can head back to section D. This section is in 7, which is similar to the 7/4 that we play in the beginning of the song, except that the time signature is actually in 7/8, not 7/4. So again, you're counting 7 notes per measure, 7 counts per measure, but now an eighth note is equal to 1 count instead of a quarter note. In effect, the measures in 7/8 will go twice as fast as the measures of 7/4. Anyway, in this section, you'll play quarter note hits on the trash hat, which will give things kind of a 4/4 feel while you're playing a syncopated dotted eighth note pattern on the bass drum and ghosting a lot on your snare drum. Now on to sections G and H. Sections G and H are in 7/4, and they're very similar to one another with the exception of the hi-hat part. In the four measures of section G, you're playing eighths on the hi-hat, and in the four measures of section H, you're playing quarters. Underneath that, the snare and bass drum play essentially the same thing in both sections. In both, you're playing snare hits every few eighth notes, followed immediately by 2 16th note hits on your bass drum. Sections K and L. Section K is essentially the drum solo portion of the song. It begins with a funky syncopated 16th note bass drum pattern that's accented on the hi-hat. To understand this bass drum pattern better though, I think it's helpful to actually skip over the drum solo straight on to section L so you can hear the pattern in its entirety. In a nutshell, it's basically a bunch of dotted eighth notes and 16th notes, and the pattern repeats itself completely after 3 measures. Here's an example of the pattern slowed down. Once you become familiar with this pattern, section K becomes much easier to play because it's simply a 4/4 beat over top of this pattern. On to section K. I did not play this solo note for note, I'll be honest with you. In fact, I didn't even really try. The reason for that is that I simply interpreted it as a drum solo, so I decided to just play it my own way. However, having said that, I did my best to transcribe the solo as it's played in the recording. So, this is how that transcription sounds, and I think it's pretty close to what Matt is playing in his solo. Thank you all for watching this video. I hope this was helpful and that it made it a little bit easier to figure out what's going on in the song. I didn't cover every section, so if you have any other questions, please feel free to let me know that, by posting it in the YouTube comments. And last but not least, please let me know if you have any covers or lessons that you would like to see in the future from me. Thanks again.